Good morning, good afternoon. Thank you for joining Edelman Global Advisory and Trivium for what will definitely be a great discussion on the two congresses. The recently concluded China's legislative annual session, the National People's Congress, and the Chinese People's Political Consultative Conference, CPPCC, and the 118th U.S. Congress, which kicked off in January but has made China a top focus, particularly for the House Republicans. My name is China Haas. I work at Edelman Global Advisory on the China team, and I'll be moderating today's discussion. There's a lot to unpack in both the U.S. Congress and the Chinese NPC, and we only have 45 minutes, so we're going to keep today's discussion pretty top level and address the top themes coming out of both of the legislative priorities for the year ahead, what they mean for the broader U.S.-China relationship, and what they mean for business in particular. We're really thrilled to be joined by Trey McArver, co-founder of Trivium China, which produces some of the best and most timely coverage on China's political and economic policy landscape, as well as Marty Reiser from EGA's senior advisor, who has deep knowledge and insight on the inner workings of Capitol Hill, and our very own Lee Waddell, Edelman Global Advisory's COO, who has built her career at the intersection of U.S.-China business relations. Okay, so first, before we really kick into the discussion, I want to pose to you all a yes-no question, and I'm going to hold you to your yes-no answer, just to kind of paint a high-level overview of where we're at. U.S.-China relations are complicated, to say the least, and tensions have soared recently. Yes or no? Will there be a thaw in the relationship this year? Trey?
No.
No.
A painful no.
Okay, Marty?
No. Sorry.
Lee?
No, equally painful and hard to
Oh,
keep.
goodness. With all of our different backgrounds, I feel like that's not necessarily a good sign for U.S.-China relations this year. Okay, so now let's just start with a quick lay of the land, because we might have some audience people who are not as familiar with China's political landscape or the U.S. landscape. So just painting a high-level overview. First, Trey, I'd like to turn to you since the NPC just concluded on March 13th. Can you just give us like a quick overview of what is the NPC, why it's important, and what are your top 3 takeaways from this year?
Sure. So the NPC is the annual meeting of China's legislature. So it's a very important time every year, because this is the forum in which China reveals its economic policy targets and its policy priorities for the year ahead. And so that includes things like the GDP growth target, as well as other economic targets, so spending targets, energy intensity targets. So it's always important just for understanding kind of where policy is going in China and where China's economy is headed in the year to come. It's also important because as the meeting of the legislature, they do set their legislative agenda for the year ahead, which is always important for anybody trying to understand what's going on. And then finally, it's important because it's one of the rare opportunities where officials in China actually interact with the press. So the premier holds an annual press conference, but in addition to the premier, a lot of the key ministers also hold press conferences or even kind of sideline meetings with the press. So it's always an interesting time for those trying to understand what official thinking in China is. Now, this year was particularly important because every 5 years, China has a change of government. And this year was our most recent 5-yearly change of government. And so it's at the annual NPC session every 5 years that the new government is announced. So we have a new premier, we have new vice premiers, new ministers throughout the Chinese government. And in addition to new officials, the government also goes through a restructuring every 5 years. And so this year we had a few very interesting restructurings. A new science and technology commission was created. We also had some consolidation of the financial regulatory authorities, and we had a new national data bureau created as well, which I think is really interesting. Top 3 takeaways, real quick. I think the economy, the economic outlook, we have a growth target of around literally around 5%. That is at the bottom end of estimates, and I think we should all be I think that's still strong growth, but I don't think there is a lot of scope for China to outperform this year. So I think we're looking at strong but not outstanding growth. I think the second one is that geopolitics really kind of hung over this NPC. So Xi Jinping made some very interesting comments about the United States in particular. It was, I think, the first time that he's publicly said that the United States is explicitly said that the United States is attempting to kind of hold China back and keep it down. And I think that unfortunately augurs very poorly for the US-China outlook and bilateral relations. And then third, I think the new premier, Li Chang, said all the right things and has the business community pretty excited. And so, I think that's going to be a little bit of a dynamic tension in the year ahead is, at least for the business community, is this kind of optimism about the new government and their approach to economic management, combined with increasing anxiety over the geopolitical tensions that are increasingly making it difficult for foreign companies, particularly American companies, to operate in China.
Great. Well, we'll definitely get into a lot more of those details in the conversation. Looking forward to it. Marty, I'd like to turn to you real quickly to kind of paint a high-level overview of the environment on China in Congress. What is top of mind for some of the congressional lawmakers re China? I know it's top of mind for the House Republicans, but would love your thoughts on what they're really thinking about.
Yeah, it's not just House Republicans, by the way. I think it's a pretty bipartisan focus and bicameral focus. China is going to be one of the top priorities for Congress throughout the 118th Congress. I think a couple things to really keep in mind moving forward. Most of the people on this webinar and in the business community and the think tank community, they've spent a lot of time on U.S.-China relations. And they've done it in the context of where U.S. policy was very much focused on cooperation and integration and globalization. And we have to reorient our mindset for what these new members of Congress are. Over half of the Republicans have been elected since 2018. And that's, similar numbers on the Democratic side as well. And they come from a very different perspective. They're not steeped in U.S.-China policy, but they are listening to their constituents. Many on the Republican side come from areas where they certainly haven't felt like they've benefited a great deal from globalization. And the public's perception of China has changed dramatically over the last eight or so years, where 75% of Americans back in 2017 had a positive view of China. That's down to 18% right now. And the members of Congress reflect that attitude. Having said that, this is an area where there is very serious thought being put and very serious bipartisan hope for bipartisan cooperation between Democrats and Republicans. Many in the business community may not love what comes out of that bipartisan cooperation, but there's certainly going into this Congress a desire to work closely. Speaker McCarthy obviously had a pretty dramatic election to the speakership. He has a 4-seat majority, country closely divided. Having said that, he's working very closely with Democratic leader Hakeem Jeffries on the issue of China. They're holding joint meetings together on the issue of China. They put together the Select Committee on the Strategic Competition between the U.S. and the Communist Party of China. It was named that way because Democrats asked to change the name to not focus on China, but to focus on the Communist Party. And Speaker McCarthy agreed to that. The chairman is Mike Gallagher. He's a veteran, young, up-and-coming intellectual, spent time in the intelligence community, widely regarded as a serious guy and also a pretty serious China hawk. The ranking member, Representative Krister Monti from Illinois, has co-sponsored bills in the past with Chairman Gallagher on China issues, and the entire committee on both sides of the aisle are are not bomb throwers. They're serious people. They've been given the Cannon Caucus Room, which is a historic room where they had Watergate hearings and the January 6 hearings as their hearing room for the 118th Congress. Again, signifying how important the issue is. The other factor that I think is going to be unique, and this is a whole new dynamic. Generally speaking, when business community have come in and talk about global economic issues, members of Congress, whether they agreed with them or disagreed with them, really believed the business leaders had more information than the members of Congress themselves and more expertise. That's not true when it comes now to the issues related to China. Members of Congress believe they have better information than the business community because they're seeing the intel, and which is a fact. Whether that intel is good or not is another question. But they are seeing a set of information that is not the business community is not privy to. So it's a very, very different dynamic. Having said that, there's not a ton of consensus yet on what to do. They believe that this is a serious national security threat, and that it is the premier national security threat for the next 20 to 30 years. But this is not the Cold War. China and U.S. are very economically integrated, and there's the possibility of doing as much harm as good to the U.S. based on U.S. actions. And so it's going to take time for Congress to sort that out. Not every committee, but virtually every committee in the House has a piece of the China relationship. They're not going to cede authority over to the Select Committee. So there are lots of different perspectives that are going to be heard. Foreign Affairs Committee, Energy and Commerce Committee, Judiciary Committee on intellectual property issues, Ways and Means Committee on tariff and trade issues, et cetera, and the list goes on. The Financial Services Committee on outbound investment. So this is going to be a long, complicated process, but it's going to remain a big focus.
Great, thank you. That's definitely a big focus across all major jurisdictions on the Hill then. Lee, so kicking it out a little bit, there's a new political landscape in both China and the United States with a whole new leadership team coming in on the Chinese side, and then this new political dynamic that Marty was just talking about. Where does business stand? How are they viewing some of these political changes on both sides, and how are they thinking about navigating it?
Yeah, so I think not only a whole new political landscape, but as Marty was making a really interesting point about, members of Congress thinking they have better intel. That may very well be true, as we haven't been to China for 3 years and business hasn't been there to see, the headquarters haven't been there to see and talk to the people and see what's happening. They certainly know if their approvals are going through and their sales are increasing, but they haven't had the chance to engage. And so right now, I think the issue is everybody needs to rethink what their China strategy is. Space is really narrow to engage for the reasons that Trey said, the toughening relationship in China, for the reasons Marty said, the toughening relations in the US. When business speaks, you could get arrows from each side and paint a target on your back. The tendency has been to kind of shrink back and shy away from the engagement at this moment just because it's fraught. This is, though, the time, I think, to engage. And Marty, I've heard you even say that the Select Committee would like to hear from you, and you should be open to going and talking to them and explaining. I think the needle is harder to thread, but it's more important than ever to thread it. So there's a few things you can do that are really, really key right now. One, I think everybody needs to be ready to explain why you're in China, justify it, have the rationale down, and stand by it. You're there for sound business reasons. It's the second largest economy in the world. It's the largest population in the world. There are many reasons to be there. Continue to explain them and stand by those. But also be mindful of all of the sensitivities and explain the guardrails you have on your relationship. How are you navigating the human rights issues? How are you navigating the Uyghur issue, if that applies to your firm? How are you protecting your data? To build the relationships, again, both markets. I think the US Congress is open to hearing it. They're not trying to trip up normal course of business, but really focusing, as Marty said, on the big flashpoints and the big national security issues and threats that we have. That said, there are sensitive issues like tech and the like. In China, it's absolutely critical right now to build up your relationships. You have a whole new bench, as Trey was talking about. I think you need to, they're all Xi loyalists, right? We have a bunch of Xi loyalists in place. There are upsides to that, in that they really know what Xi's mind is, how to position your issues to get traction. The downsides of, they're very wary to take on issues right now, particularly if they don't know how higher ups are viewing it or if they're sensitive issues. We've noticed, less uptake on issues from traditional allies within the system. But it's time to, really build your relationships in China. And third scenario plan, the chance of, sanctions, hot conflict is low, but certainly not zero at this point. So be ready for crisis, start to figure out how you're going to navigate it. We learned our lesson after Russia. This is much different, but scenario planning, lots of companies are looking right now at what they're going to do. I think, though, there's the political rhetoric that is really, really tough. And then there's business, which is going on. Exports are up, FDI is up, although cooling. China is going to grow, as Trey said, at 5%. Business is moving forward. Sentiment is getting tough, as we've all noted, that U.S. firms are really having to navigate the geopolitics, so they're getting wary. But I think for American companies to really be competitive now, it would be very constructive to have an economic policy with China in addition to the national security policy, and that's something that businesses may want to think about starting to advocate, that we have really left the economic relationship, the economic framework, where we are driving to with China economically, undefined.
Great. Yeah, no. And as you mentioned, engagement across the leaders of both in both systems is going to be super important going forward. Maybe that can be a segue into our next discussion. I wanted to touch a little bit more on some of the key leadership changes and developments in both markets. And perhaps, Lee, since I went to you last, I'll start with you on this one. Coming out of the MPC, what were some of your top takeaways on the leadership changes, especially after Xi Jinping consolidated his authority over the party in October? What are your top takeaways from the recent developments this March?
I have to say a lot of my top takeaways were formed by the excellent analysis at Trivium. So hopefully we'll be in strong agreement on this. And I won't take too much of your territory, Trey. But first of all, obviously Xi has consolidated his power. His loyalists are in place. I talked about that. Policymaking really resides with one man, and the party is the governing vehicle for that. In ways it has been, but it is much more consolidated now and much more codified. The party is in charge of policy. The government will implement. I think we've noted definitely the rise of technocrats within the system. There are a lot more people with, technical engineering, and like backgrounds. I've been watching the astronauts and veterans of the space program ascend the ranks. Here too, I would look at not even just at the central level, which is really key and important to everybody, but start looking at the provinces. These are the rising stars. We always counsel our clients, go and build relationships with these provincial leaders. Provinces are the sizes of, decent sized countries. They have a lot of authority, but they're rising stars in the system. And it's easier to build relationships at the provincial level when they're in the provinces than when they get to the central level. So really at this time, I think, take a look around provinces, particularly where your business operates, and really make sure you have strong relationships with the leadership in those provinces. They were likely going places.
Trey, similar question. Who are some of the key leaders that you guys are watching coming out of the MPC? And after the reshuffling, there wasn't actually some reshuffling in some of the key ministries, like, the financial regulators. What is your take on that?
Yeah, so it was interesting. In some ways, things really went to plan. So I think, as expected, Li Qiang, the former Shanghai Party secretary, former chief of staff to Xi Jinping, was appointed as the premier. That's what we were expecting. Similarly, another of Xi's former chiefs of staff, Ding Xuexiang, was appointed to the number 2 position in the government, the executive vice premier, and the 3 other vice premiers, He Lifeng, who was at Xi Jinping's wedding in 1987, a good old friend of Xi Jinping, is another one of the vice premiers, as expected. But we then had 2 technocrats, Zhang Guoqing and Liu Guozhong, who neither of which, to our knowledge, have deep or close ties with Xi Jinping. And I do think speak to kind of one of the trends that we've seen under Xi is that it's not just loyalty, it's also kind of competence that is being rewarded in this system. But they also were expected. So at the top of the government, everything kind of played out as expected. There weren't any huge surprises, but I guess to the extent there were surprises, it was that we did have 3 ministers who were reappointed who we expected to retire. And that was the Minister of Finance, Liu Kun, the central bank governor, Yi Gang, and the Minister of Science and Technology, Wang Zhigang. And I think their reappointment, what they show is that, as I said, we have a new government. We also have some restructuring going on, particularly within the science and technology system, as well as within the financial regulatory system. And so I think at this time of transition, where China is really, 2023 for China is all about economic recovery. 2022 was a very bad year. The last 3 years have been difficult. And so this is the year that they really try to right the economic ship. And I think, by keeping the Minister of Finance and the head of the central bank in place, these are both highly respected officials. They're, respectively the point person for fiscal policy and monetary policy. Keeping them in place is just to have kind of continuity of policy, make sure that while all of this change is happening, you have some steady hands on the till to really kind of guide this economic recovery, which is the real focus here, particularly in the first half of the year, as you're trying to kind of build that momentum. And then I think the Minister of Science and Technology is a similar story where, the kind of arguably the largest part of the government restructuring was restructuring the science and technology system. This is, by the way, a direct response to the United States and United States policy, particularly the export controls on semiconductors, but more broadly efforts over the past 5 years to restrict Chinese companies' access to American technology. China's now really focused on trying to build technology at home. And so I think they're restructuring that system. And so they kept the minister in place to oversee the restructuring and kind of make sure that proceeds smoothly. And also, I just want to kind of piggyback on something Lee said. We do have, it's not just at the central level. We also have a lot of new leaders at the provincial level. So throughout the system, you have a lot of new people in new seats. And one thing that was notable for foreign businesses at the NPC was that attracting foreign investment is a high priority. So, every year they kind of lay out their priorities, and attracting foreign investment is always a priority. This year, it was a much higher priority than it has been in the past. That's certainly the rhetoric that you were getting from the premier as well as other economic officials. So I think, especially because China is focused on economic recovery this year, they see foreign businesses as a key part of that. It's a really an excellent time to be engaging with these new officials because they've been told they need to talk to foreign businesses. They're focused on growing the economy, so they're happy for any kind of advice that companies can give. So I do think that's something that everybody operating in China should certainly have top of mind right now.
I think that's a really good point, and that was definitely one of the interesting outcomes from the NPC. We saw a focus on the importance of FDI from some of their top officials. At the same time, from the diplomacy, the diplomatic corps, and even Xi, there was a hardening of rhetoric, and as you've already mentioned, calling out the United States for the very first time for containing China vis-a-vis these export controls and China's growth. Lee, I wanted to ask, on this whole topic of FDI is welcomed again to China. Is that going to preclude U.S. business? Will it make it harder for U.S. business? How are we looking at U.S. business opportunities in this new landscape where FDI is encouraged?
Yeah.
The geopolitical.
It's a question mark, right? FDI is encouraged from the U.S. kind of question mark, and it'll be up to business, I think, to test that, right? Certainly the rhetoric is there. We need to now go and test it. We have, as Trey was saying, competent officials. Li Qiang, doesn't have central government level experience, headed up Shanghai, which has the most foreign direct investment. Certainly he's used to engaging with officials and understands how to promote that. So we'll see. I think it depends too on your sector. Really, if you are in one of these sensitive sectors like tech, decisions are going all the way up to the top, probably even the tippy top if they're big, deals in very sensitive sectors like semiconductors and quantum computing, AI, all of these things that we've listed. It's a hard level to influence, so that'll be a difficult sector to navigate for many companies. I think too the concern really is about politics ruling. How will U.S. businesses remain competitive if we don't have our allies kind of taking the same tough stand and making the same actions and regulatory moves that we are? The Europeans in particular are not taking quite the same stance. They've certainly rhetorically, but we have a series of European leaders heading over to China with delegations and willing to engage. So how do we remain competitive against the U.S. Or against our foreign companies? How do U.S. companies navigate that? And again, let's advocate a real economic policy here.
Mm-hmm. Tech competition is definitely top of mind for leaders of both governments. And so here, Marty, I'd actually like to turn it back to you. I mean, Congress pushed through massive expansion of U.S. export control authorities back in 2018. And we've seen both the Trump administration and the Biden administration use those to, really increase the pressure on China's high-tech industries. So instead of focusing on export controls, which I know is top of mind for other leaders of Congress, I'd like to talk about another live conversation around restricting outbound investment to China to close a perceived loophole where U.S. investment is going into China's high-tech industries that are unknowingly advancing China's military capabilities. And I understand the administration is working on its own effort, but it's still a live conversation on the Hill. I have another element of the focus on the commercial relationship on the Hill, but I'm going to get to that in a second because I want to hear your thoughts on the outbound portion first.
Well, it's probably the most complicated issue that with the economic relationship, anyways, that Congress has to deal with. The administration is working on an executive order. It could come out at the end of March, maybe in April, and we'll see. Is that going to be sort of a notification type regulation, or are they going to give themselves the ability to block outbound investment through that regulation? We don't know the answer to that yet. We'll have to see and understand. There'll be a period of notice and comment as well. But Congress will have a reaction to the administration's proposal. This is an area where the danger is you can do more harm than good. Trey mentioned, and I think Lee mentioned, one of China's main goals is to build up their own technology sector and not have to rely so much. So if we block our own involvement there, it just gives China that much more incentive to put that many more resources into building up their own semiconductor industry. So it needs to be done in a thoughtful way. And there are varying perspectives in both parties on the wisdom and how to do it. Chairman McHenry of the Financial Services Committee in particular, but many members of the Financial Services Committee are very skeptical of outbound investment restrictions. They believe that makes U.S. less competitive. Mike McCall, who is I call him America First globalist. He sort of straddles both sides of that issue. He's the chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee. He's very much focused on getting an outbound investment regime put in place. Senator Warner, Senator Cornyn from Texas, Republican and Democrat, they have proposals in this area. So there's a lot of players, and it's really, really complicated. So, for that reason, what we may have for a while is whatever the administration comes out from their EO. Because Congress may be too divided to legislate quickly in this area.
Quickly, Trey, do you have any thoughts on how the Chinese government might respond to legislative or executive action on an outbound investment review?
China's in a tough spot when it comes to these issues because, this is kind of the nightmare scenario for China, right? And I think, this really... obviously, the trade war kind of started early 2018. I think the kind of watershed moment from the Chinese perspective was when they placed export controls on certain components to ZTE, a big Chinese telecoms company, in April 2018. That prompted Xi Jinping to call Donald Trump and ask him to remove those restrictions, which Donald Trump did. But I think that was a real wake-up call for the Chinese, that they were incredibly, I think, exposed to the stroke of a pen in the Oval Office, potentially being able to undermine one of their most innovative companies, perhaps, just kneecap an entire sector. And so I think the strategy for the past 5 years, I mean, we've continued to have a whole series of actions coming out of the US targeting China, from tariffs to export controls, to placing companies on the entity list. And China's reaction has always been relatively muted. They've tried not to escalate because they have the most to lose, right? I mean, they are still incredibly much more dependent on our economy or the U.S. economy than vice versa. And so I think what we've seen from Beijing is 5 years of head scratching. They have been actively developing legislation to try to combat this. So we've had an anti-foreign sanctions law that was passed. We've had rules passed by MOFCOM that would be blocking rules. We've have China's own version of its entity list, the unreliable entities list, that has been rolled out. But frankly, all of these things are kind of nascent. They're unused, untested, imperfect. We do see China now also cataloging potential technologies and products that they could put export controls on. So I think the strategy in Beijing at the moment is to try to figure out where China has leverage and where they might be able to inflict pain on the U.S. economy if the U.S. does something else. But I think broadly speaking, this is China is in a tough spot and they don't have great answers. So.
Mm-hmm. Lee, did you have anything you wanted to add?
Yeah, could I add? I think this has been like one of the rumor mill things, right? Everybody wants to know what's the latest with the outbound investment rule. We get asked that probably in every meeting that we have. And the latest that I have heard to stoke the rumor mill, I guess, is to say that it was, Marty pointed out between notification and blocking, and it looks like the administration is looking at notification, some sort of a system led by Treasury. I think the U.S. China Business Council reported this, and that we would do like a 1-year pilot project and see what's it, just to kind of buy some time to be able to see how this all works. To Marty's point about could this do more harm than good, and see how it shakes out. So, and then the sectors have been the other thing that everybody's been for. What sectors will it be? And are we able to define these sectors really well? Where quantum computing, AI, probably the higher semiconductors. There was talk about biotech. Is it in? Is it out? Blinken mentioned it specifically in his speech, right, when he talked about we need the biggest lead we can possibly get in the U.S., not just to be ahead. We need to broaden our lead. Biotech was in there. It seems out now. It's ever evolving, it seems. It's not only the most complicated issue, like Marty said, but it's the one that just keeps kind of swirling around and ever evolving in this atmosphere. But that's the latest that we've heard. I don't know if that tracks, Marty and Trey, with what you.
Yep, absolutely.
Yeah.
There's a definite, prism of interconnecting relationships and responses that I would love to get into a little bit more. But first, I'd like to ask Marty another question about how Congress is approaching the commercial relationship. Yes, Gallagher is a super serious legislator, as you've mentioned, and he does not want to unreasonably upend regular trade. And you've noted that he is open to engagement, which I think is very valuable for companies to remember, thoughtful engagement. But Gallagher has also mentioned, at least in the initial conception of the House Select Committee on Strategic Competition with the CCP, that entertainment and sports and other sort of U.S. sectors that might not fully represent U.S. values might also be called to testimony. And the committee does have subpoena powers, and he has said he wanted to leverage those powers. What is the latest thinking on this front? How are U.S. values or companies that might not have a specific national security bent be scrutinized by Congress?
Yeah, it's a good question. So Chairman Gallagher has 4 basic priorities. He wants to lay out the national security case in a bipartisan way and get the American people to the point where they understand that, from his perspective, that China is the premier national security threat to the United States over the next 20 years. The second, that this is not just an economic competition. This is a competition of our values. And they're having a hearing this week on the Uyghur situation. They're gonna have some witnesses that apparently came from the camps. It's going to be prime time hearing. They're going to lay out a case that this is a competition between of the values of 2 very different systems. The third is the economic competition. We need to bring supply chains back here to the United States, and the fourth one is really kind of focused on the Taiwan issue. But getting to your point about the sports leagues and other and entertainment, this gets to be. There's a lot of politics that get caught up in this very, very quickly, and that's where it will break down a little bit more on partisan lines. There are a number of Republicans that have not been all that happy with corporate America, quote, wokeness. And so companies that operate in China but are criticizing Republican policies are probably more likely to get called up to testify about China, their operations in China, than other companies. And that's just a reality. But Democrats are not going to be part of that. And so that breaks down that bipartisan consensus that Gallagher is really trying to drive. So I don't believe the Select Committee is going to go down that path very soon, if at all. But that leaves a whole bunch of other committees free to do what they would like to do. And they have subpoena power as well. So that is an issue that will continue. It will be event specific, event driven. I think, things that happened 2 or 3 years ago that various quarters may have criticized the company for something 2 or 3 years ago. If they don't do it again, they're probably not going to get called up. But if they say something 6 months from now that irritates a chairman, well, that may be cause for them to be called to testify.
I appreciate your note on the bipartisanship and the hopes of bipartisanship within this committee, and that, perhaps understanding that they won't be able to produce anything if they don't have the full backing on these types of topics. It might break down. Unfortunately, they don't have they don't have legislative power, and so a lot of the actual legislating will fall to the committees where there perhaps isn't the same bipartisanship. And so on that, and we're in a divided Congress. So like in the grand scheme of things, it's very easy as China watchers sitting in the United States in particular to say China tops the agenda, when in reality, as your great EGA and Sessions note, there's a lot of other very big, very real issues that Congress is grappling with. The budget fight, banks failing. Where does China really stack up in the whole list of congressional, the congressional agenda? And what legislating is actually going to be possible this year or in the next in this 118th Congress with a divided Congress?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I would say look at who the real players are on this. Speaker McCarthy created the Select Committee, but he did it in a bipartisan way. And this is a 4-year project of his. He came up with this idea 4 years ago. It almost happened in 2019, fell apart at the last minute, but he revised it. Senate Majority Leader Schumer is a longtime, quote, China hawk, particularly on currency issues. He almost single-handedly, maybe not single-handedly, but he was a driving force between getting the CHIPS legislation passed and a plant put up in New York as part of that. He's very serious about China issues. He's encouraging his members on both sides in the Senate to continue to press forward. And yes, it's a divided Congress, but if you look back at the history of divided Congresses, you do get some major bipartisan breakthroughs at different points of the process. So I do think there is significant likelihood that that this Congress will produce legislation related to the economic relationship with China. I think the outbound investment stuff is going to be particularly challenging, but there's a whole bunch of other areas where discrete pieces of legislation can move forward, and the bipartisan support for efforts to bring manufacturing back to the U.S. will continue to get funded and supported.
Great. We're coming close to time, so I just have a couple more questions. And so first, I want to turn to Trey because we've already kind of talked about the, you noted that some of the restructuring that happened with most was in direct response to U.S. expansion of U.S. export controls, and you've noted that they're developing a lot of different authorities or regulatory toolbox to respond to these things. Marty just mentioned that McCarthy is a leader in the House and wants to, is very interested on the China front. He might meet with President Tsai Ing-wen in the coming weeks here. And actually, we did see China use the unreliable entity list for the first time with some U.S. defense firms that aren't particularly, active in mainland China, but it was definitely a signal. How does the Chinese government really watch U.S. Congress? Do they watch it with, fear, like concern that there is this growing bipartisanship moving against the CCP, or do they see it more as a dysfunctional thing and they're just kind of waiting for us to make a mistake?
I think it's probably C, all of the above. Yeah, I mean, I think it's, there has been kind of I think maybe sea change is too strong, but but we'll go with sea change because I can't think of a better metaphor of opinion in Beijing. I think, when you had Trump come in and, I mean, we can actually date the hardening of kind of a U.S. Stance towards China back to the Obama administration pretty easily, I think. But I think things really kind of picked up under the Trump administration. And I think at that point, actually, China, was relatively relaxed about it for a couple of reasons. One, it felt like it was probably a blip. And two, I think they felt very confident in kind of where they were. And they felt that, domestically, that the U.S. was, basically kind of falling apart, right? That they saw the kind of the increased partisanship, they saw riots on the street, and I think they just felt, that they were in a good place. I think 5 years later, it's the exact opposite. The United States continues to be riven by partisanship. We obviously, I think, are all aware of all of the kind of problems in American society, but it is ultimately resilient. And even amidst that partisanship, there is bipartisanship on China. And, the tough stance towards China has actually intensified under a different administration. You now have a bipartisan committee that looks pretty committed to driving through legislation that's going to be tough on China. And I think China sees all of that very clearly. And I think, I think you're seeing, a shift in China. I think that's part of the reason that Xi Jinping explicitly called out the U.S. That was a signal that, hey, this is not going away. And we now, I think much in the way that you have in the U.S., China's now trying to figure out, okay, if we're going to be in a sustained period of kind of competition / confrontation with the United States, what does that mean? How do we manage that, especially when we have so many intertwined interests? And I think that's why this is a really fascinating moment, is that nobody really has the answer to those questions, but we all know something has to change. And so we're kind of searching for a new modus vivendi, and it's just not there. And going back to kind of where we started, I think that is why it's so important for businesses and stakeholders on both sides of the Pacific to be engaging. If you have constructive ideas, people want ideas. This is not set in stone. It's a very dynamic situation, and obviously with a broad range of possibilities. some of which, frankly, are pretty scary. So I think it's very important that people do advocate for constructive solutions, because I think people are looking for them.
And I think just to that point, there's been a growing number of articles talking about groupthink in Washington. And if we all just accept this bipartisan tough on China, and there's no downside to being tough on China, what are we leading towards? And lots of people, very smart people, sounding the alarm bell that we're heading towards war footing here. And do we really want this? And should we not take a step back and look? And there's a real role for business then to play in advocating that. Step back and take a look at where we're actually driving to. Thanks, China.
That was exactly my next question to you, was on the group think, and then whether or not that will actually make some progress. Well, I mean,
worked together for too long, China, if we can reach minds like that. Yeah.
We are technically at time, but before I let you all leave, if I can just ask another yes/no question, perhaps. The biggest thing on everybody's mind and on cross media titles is she is in Russia today meeting Putin. Will we see progress on Ukraine with China's support? Lee, yes, no.
Limited, but no.
Limited, but no. Marty?
No, it's
no.
Terrible conflict.
Okay. Trey?
Yeah,
No.
yeah, it's tough.
No.
Yeah.
Oh, man.
No, an unfortunate no, a sad no, a disappointed no.
I like to be an optimist, so I'm going to say yes.
Okay.
But
Maybe some rhetorical good wins there, right? Some nice talking points, but yeah.
Thank you all for a great discussion. I think we could all continue for an extra 45 minutes, but I don't want to take over your mornings or your afternoons too much longer. Trey, Marty, Lee, great having you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.